This is Away, Series 2, a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 5. Hello all. I am running a bath while I'm recording this because I've been short on time lately and I'm just trying to get a few things done all at one time, one of which is taking care of myself a little bit and taking a nice hot bath. So I'm sorry if you can hear water in the background. I hope you can't. Or maybe you find it soothing. Anyway, in episode 4, we got through almost all of the doctor's opinion, but not quite. I left you with a real cliffhanger. Just kidding. I mean, unless you're totally fascinated by it all, and yet you still didn't Google any of it because you don't like spoilers. Okay, so the two stories referenced at the end of the second letter in the chapter, The Doctor's Opinion, are Hank Parkhurst and Fitz Mayo. Who? You'd be right if you just thought, I don't remember Steph saying either of those names in the first 2 long episodes. I didn't, because there are so many people who play a part in AA's development, and their importance varies. I'm not saying that Hank and Fitz aren't super important. They are. So, before we continue, I'll give a quick overview of these guys. Hank Parkhurst. Dr. Silkworth describes him as, quote, a case of pathological mental deterioration. He's often referred to as AA number 2 because he's Bill's first success story at Towns Hospital in 1935 in New York. Hank and Bill's lives, for better or worse, are inextricably linked from there forward. Hank plays a big role in early AA and the Big Book. He was an agnostic who, together with Jim Burwell, fought to keep the language as accessible as possible. In fact, it's Hank who takes in Bill and Lois when they have to leave their home in Brooklyn. Hank does drink again, and so begins the fracas. In truth, the problems caused by Hank, or that arose from the conflict between him and Bill, forced the developing institution of AA to very carefully consider each of its stated traditions. There's a lot there, and it's worth reading about Hank. Check out aabeyondbelief.org or barefootsworld.org to learn a lot more about him and his impact on AA. All right, so Fitz Mayo, does the name get any waspier? He's known as AA number 3, maybe because he was Bill's second success story in New York, straight out of Towns Hospital. Kind of. He, too, played an important role in AA's beginnings, and Fitz was the one to establish AA firmly in Washington, D.C. Interesting tidbit, Fitz was very insistent that Christian doctrine be at the heart of the Big Book for 2 reasons. He was raised in a strict Episcopalian home, and he had a sort of white light experience after meeting Bill. As it happens, he's the one who gave the gift of AA to Jim Burwell. The two were friends till the end. Again, as with them all, there's so much more to read about Fitz, so get Googling. All right, so Silky finished off the letter advising that every alcoholic read the book with an open mind. And I earnestly advise the same. Perhaps it seems antiquated. It is. Perhaps it seems florid and at times ridiculous. It is. Perhaps it seems sexist, even misogynistic. Sometimes it is. Perhaps you don't identify with every description. You shouldn't. But there's a chance you will. There's a chance that something buried within the next 164 pages will speak to you. You can be both skeptical and open-minded. You should be both. As my own doctrine dictates, question everything. And with that, we'll start Chapter 1, Bill's story. I'm not going to pretend I love this. I don't. In my opinion, he is still very much handicapped by his own shortcomings or defects or resentments, as well as the attitudes of society at large when he writes this. As are they all, right? They've got, 3 years of sobriety each, if that? We'll address the terminology he uses a little later, and we'll try to reframe the language for the 21st century. But let's read a little first. He begins with his drunkalogue. War fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned, and we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. Skip down. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is ne'er forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. Not the pot of today. Ominous warning which I failed to heed. 22 and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, for had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation? My talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. Skipping forward. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapons that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. I had developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. Skipping ahead. At the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of large expense account. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. So, here's the thing. Maybe it's because I'm a woman. Maybe it's because I'm a woman born in 1978 and living in 2019. I don't know why exactly. But the beginning of his story doesn't speak to me at all. Zero identification. He doesn't really write about any feelings, and he skips over enormously important parts of his own story. I know. His terrible childhood is not what makes him an alcoholic. I mean, or is it a part of it? I think most of us by now know that while trauma alone isn't the cause of addiction, it certainly contributes. By leaving out those incredibly painful truths, he may be trying to move away from assigning any kind of blame on anyone but himself for his alcoholism. And I get that. I recently saw a quote on Instagram that said, "Your wound is probably not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility." So true. But I think by now we know, too, that addressing and dressing the wound is also pretty important to any kind of recovery. So when I first read this, I knew nothing about Bill's real story, his childhood pain and the fear it must have caused, the heartache. I knew nothing about his battles with depression, and I didn't learn any of it in the beginning of his story either. So anyway, let's move on to look at the stage he's setting. He's already engineered it, rightly or wrongly, to ignore the childhood stuff and any of the feelings he has had growing up or when he was sent overseas during World War I. He's jumping into his story really when the drinking has already started to get ugly. I think this, too, is perhaps thoughtfully engineered. I think Bill is trying to key the reader into the quote-unquote defects he or she will examine later. I'd proved to the world I was important. Many people became very rich. Why not I? Blah, blah, blah. So it's the second page of Bill's story, and he's alerting the reader to his problem of ego, as he later refers to it. Moving along, he's pushing us into another defect, or another defect identification, when he writes, everyone spent in thousands and shattered in millions. He goes on, it was fun to roam around the exclusive golf course. I had the impeccable coat of tan, one seat. So he's flipping between the description of his horrific drinking and the fancy life. That's what people mean when they say the outsides don't match the insides. And his drive. He's driven by materialism. He needs to keep up with the Joneses. So maybe here's a place to reframe. Just change up the vibe of the language here. What is Bill really saying beneath all the garbage writing? What's between the lines? He needs to keep up with the Joneses. He needs to look successful. That's what hides the rest. And this is what success looked like in his world at the time. He needs to look successful in order to cover up reality. And while he doesn't talk about the feelings exactly, maybe he can't yet. Maybe with only 3 years sober and being a man in 1939, he just doesn't have access to those feelings yet. He does allude to that. So, let's think about his description of the drinking and pull on that a little. Let's unravel it. So this is moving a little further down. My drinking assumed more serious proportions. The remonstrances of my friends terminated unhappy scenes in our apartment. Liquor caught up with me. Okay. So we know now, even if he didn't then, that the drinking is a symptom not only of his alcoholism, but of his pain and his shame. He's in the torturous cycle of alcoholism, in which the only medication for your sadness or humiliation is one and the same as the poison contributing to those feelings. I think because he writes in this extremely florid but still somehow unsentimental way, it can be really hard to identify with his story for some people. I think when we pare it down, go to the bare bones of the story, we can better relate. The story continues in much the same way. Descriptions of the cycle, really, renewed promises to stop, more attempts at success. It's on page 6 that I first, really identify. And it's with one single line. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. In fact, for me, that alone can keep me sober in the worst of times. This is going to sound trite, but there is no emotion I have sober that even comes close to being as bad as those morning after feelings. Not just the physical discomfort, right? Not just the huge pores and dry sweats, abdominal cramps and dehydration, the sore muscles, the swollen eyes. Not just that. All that plus the complete and utter hopelessness, the sadness, the shame. And I'm far enough along in sobriety now with enough life experience in sobriety to say nothing else comes close. If you can live, and you did, with that level of discomfort, then you can absolutely deal with the relatively minor discomfort of early sobriety. I never want to feel that way again. And the best part is I never have to. So, on he goes to describe more battles lost to liquor. I cringe when he writes, "No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity." I cringe not only because it's a terrible sentence, but because self-pity. That's another push to the reader, because later in the book, self-pity is going to come up as one of our primary problems. The thing is, it isn't for everyone. Maybe it was for him. Or maybe later in life he realized it wasn't self-pity, but clinical depression. I don't know. I do identify with loneliness and despair, but I'm not certain those feelings are always accompanied by self-pity. Maybe I'm wrong. So, on we go through some more cycles with Bill, and finally on page 8, we get to the more uplifting stuff when Ebby visits Bill at home. Remember, Ebby was going to the Oxford group meetings in Vermont, and he'd come down to New York to visit the Bowery Mission. And here's something about Bill's terrible state. Let's read. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend, Ebby Thatcher, asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Of course he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. The door opened, and he stood there fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? He looked straight at me. Simply but smilingly, he said, "I've got religion." I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how 2 men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. Remember, that was Sebra and Shep. He had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. So it's important, and it's why Bill makes mention of it, that Ebby did no ranting. And this is where those smug fundamentalist members go so wrong. He did no ranting. Ebby says, for all intents and purposes, this is what worked for me, and it might work for you too, but you don't have to do it exactly the same way I did it. You just have to try. Skip to page 12, and he says just that. Why don't you choose your own conception? And here's the really important part. It was only a matter of being willing. You don't even have to finish that sentence. That's it. That's all you need to get sober. Willingness to try something new, willingness to do something different. Okay, so to the top of page 14. Oh, boy. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Destruction of self-centeredness. So working with women, it became quickly apparent to me that wasn't their primary problem, as it wasn't mine. And the longer I'm around, the more I see it isn't most people's primary problem. We behaved in ways that were self-centered and selfish. Maybe we behaved badly, or we were full of bombast. But that's not quite the same as what it says here. And even if it's what the writers did want to say, they didn't do it well or clearly. Selfish behavior does not necessarily make you a selfish person. Bad behavior does not necessarily make you a bad person. I mean, you might sober up and turns out you are a terrible person, and AA can't help you with that. Seriously, if you're a psychopath, getting sober isn't the only change you're going to need to make. So most of us, not the socio or psychopaths, we're assholes sometimes. We let people down because drinking was more important. Whether a hangover meant you missed something or you showed up drunk for something else important, it was selfish behavior. And honestly, in my opinion, blaming the disease is kind of selfish too. I mean, yes, at the time, alcohol was your master. And so here's the beginning of the steps. Now you're abstaining. So alcohol's not your master. You are your master. And you're going to have to take responsibility for your selfish or bad behavior. If you were selfish or badly behaved. That is not the same thing as destroying a part of yourself. Let's say that again. Taking responsibility for your selfish or bad behavior is not the same thing as destroying a part of yourself. The behavior wasn't you, it was behavior. And if you're not actually a narcissistic monster, then you'll be able to identify the things you did that were maybe selfish or mean, and you'll be able to apologize for them. Or at the very least, you never have to act that way again. Maybe that's the most. A lot of people, me included, point to self-pity as selfish. It's true if you wallow around in it endlessly and torture everyone you know with your woe is me garbage. But we all feel a little self-pity sometimes, and that's okay. Really, take a minute, yell at the wall. It's not fair. When I went to examine this in myself, I realized that I always thought everyone was whispering about me, judging me. Not because they were, and not because I was so selfish, so self-centered, but because I was doing all those things to myself. I hated myself. It's very natural to project that outwards. So, rather than the destruction of self-centeredness, I think this is important. I found it helpful to think of it as the construction or reparation of self-worth. Replace arrogance with confidence. If I was arrogant, it was only because I had no real confidence. So rather than the destruction of self-centeredness, Think of it as the construction or reparation of self-worth. As for the father of light, my only father had been dead for 10 years by the time I finally got sober. And if I'm being honest, no man has ever given me any light. I mean, my husband adds to my glow. He's got his own awesome glow. Together, we shine brightly, brighter than we do alone. But my light is my light. Before I found it within myself, my light was a few women in AA who told me I never had to feel that way again. And that was all the hope I needed, all the light anyone could ever want. Okay, skipping down a little. God comes to most men gradually. I said it before. Bill's white light experience is not the norm. And he says it right here. So this is right after Ebby has come to see him at Towns Hospital for what was Bill's last stint in rehab. It's when he tells Silky he thinks he's going mad, and Silky's like, still better than the shit-faced Bill. When I read this line, originally I just replaced God with the word trust. Trust comes gradually. I don't know if I'm being articulate. I've admitted that I'm powerless over alcohol, right? So now step 2, it's about trust. I came to believe that I could trust the people in AA who were telling me I could stay sober. With each passing day, I trusted them more and more because I kept staying sober a day at a time. I had proof. And this is kind of a good lead into the bottom of the page. My friend emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said. So those women and men, my lights, were there because they took seriously the responsibility of helping others. If they had not seen working with others as imperative to their sobriety, then I would have had no one to gradually trust. We show up for ourselves, but also for others, which helps us to feel better about ourselves. This is the positive cycle. This is the antithesis of the vicious cycle. The most basic principle is at work here. Faith without works is dead, right? Words are meaningless without action. A few years ago, the Pope said, and I love quoting this, quote, "You pray for the hungry, then you feed them. That's how prayer works." So whatever you believe, don't just sit there and pray or wish or hope. Do something. Words alone don't affect change. Saying you'll get sober and getting sober are two different things. Words may ignite passion in others, but for the change to happen, someone has to act. Here and now, that is you. And it's an opportunity to be unselfish. It's an opportunity to be the person you know you are that was only masked by the alcoholism. Don't just feel sympathy. Reach out a hand and ask, how can I help? It's also a great way to get out of your own head. We'll wrap up Bill's story now by reading the last 2 paragraphs. There is, however, a vast amount of fun about it all. I suppose some would be shocked at our seeming worldliness and levity. But just underneath, there is deadly earnestness. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us, or we perish. Most of us feel we need look no further for utopia. We have it with us right here and now. Each day, my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself in a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. So, A, there totally is fun in it, not because we're terrible people who laugh at the harm we caused others, but because, oh my God, it is such a relief to know that you're not actually the worst person ever. That other people have been as badly behaved as you, and they've cleaned up their acts. They get it. They get the joke. B, yes, deadly earnestness too. We got to own it to change it. We got to do some uncomfortable things to change it. Taking responsibility can be very, very uncomfortable. But I said before, you've been uncomfortable before. You can handle it. Faith, by the way, does not have to be in God. It's what we said before. Faith, trust the people who are telling you you can do this, we promise. Because why would they lie? The key to it all is that simple talk in the kitchen that multiplied itself over and over and over again and has for more than 80 years now. Look, utopia is a little over the top. The rooms certainly aren't utopia, but I don't think that's what the writers meant. I think they meant the present. All you really have is right here, right now. That can be your utopia. I mean, life is as good as you make it. You'll get out exactly as much as you put in. Trite but true. As always, I hope this helped. I hope you feel as if, no matter what, there is a way.